A black teen walks into the mall, looking forward to a simple day of shopping, but things quickly take a turn when he's stopped by security. The officer, dismissive and mocking, assumes the teen is up to no good and questions his presence. Laughing at the teen's appearance, the guard mocks him, assuming he's just another young troublemaker. But what happens next will leave the entire mall speechless. The teen calmly reveals that his family owns the mall. Yes, the very place the officer works. What happens after this revelation will make you rethink how easily people are judged based on assumptions and appearances. The mall was bustling with energy. Shoppers wandered between high-end stores. Children ran by with ice cream cones, and the hum of lively conversations filled the air. On this ordinary afternoon, a black teen walked through the grand entrance, headed toward his favorite store. Dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, he seemed like just another teenager enjoying his day off. He didn't draw attention to himself, blending in with the crowd, but what he didn't know was that his visit to the mall was about to take a sharp turn. As he strolled down the corridor, a security guard standing near the entrance watched him closely. The officer's eyes narrowed, sizing him up in a way that seemed more dismissive than just observational. The guard wasn't sure why, but something about the teen's appearance didn't sit right with him. He assumed, based on his own biases, that the teen didn't belong in the mall, that he was just another young troublemaker, up to no good. Without hesitation, the officer approached him, his voice firm. "Hey, you! I need to see some ID." The teen, taken aback, was still polite. "What's going on?" he asked calmly, not understanding why he'd been stopped. "Just show me your ID. You can't be walking around here without it," the officer replied, his tone condescending. "We don't allow troublemakers in the mall." The teen raised an eyebrow but complied. He handed the officer his ID without protest, expecting this to be a simple misunderstanding that would soon be cleared up. But what followed was far from simple. The officer glanced at the ID, then back at the teen. He immediately scoffed. "Yeah, this looks fake. What are you even doing here?" he mocked, giving a dismissive glance up and down the teen's casual clothes. The situation had taken a turn. The teen could feel the tension rising, but instead of reacting with anger, he remained calm. His patience was about to be tested, but he was determined to handle the situation with dignity, aware that this interaction was going down a path it shouldn't have. The officer's mocking tone didn't escape the teen, but he didn't react impulsively. Instead, he stood still, maintaining a calm, almost serene composure. "Sir, this is my ID, and I'm not sure why you're questioning it," he said, his voice steady, trying to diffuse the tension that was rapidly building between them. But the security guard wasn't having it. His skepticism only deepened, and he dismissed the teen's calm approach as defiance. "You really think I'm going to believe this? You've got some nerve coming in here and thinking you're above the rules," the officer retorted, his voice growing sharper. He held the ID up to the light, squinting at it, as though he could somehow will the information into being false. His judgment was clouded, but the teen didn't flinch. He had experienced this kind of behavior before. People seeing him through the lens of prejudice and making assumptions before even getting to know him. He had long learned that sometimes staying calm and dignified in the face of unfair treatment was the only way to protect yourself. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I'm just here to shop," the teen responded, his tone polite but firm. The officer sneered, still not satisfied with the explanation. "Just here to shop, huh? That's what they all say." He eyed the teen as though he were a criminal trying to hide in plain sight. "You don't look like you belong here. People like you don't belong in places like this." You think you can just walk around with a fake ID and get away with it? The officer's voice was laced with a prejudice that was hard to ignore. Other people in the mall, noticing the interaction, slowed their pace. Some gave sympathetic looks to the teen, while others remained oblivious, unaware of the escalating tension between the two. The mall, typically filled with the hum of casual shoppers, now had a quiet unease lingering in the air as bystanders turned their attention toward the scene. The teen remained composed, refusing to let the officer's insults get under his skin, but inside, his frustration was beginning to mount. It wasn't just about the ID. It was about the assumption that he didn't belong, the assumption that his very presence was a problem. But he refused to let this officer or anyone else see him as less than. "Why don't you just let me go?" he asked, his voice still steady. "There's no need for this." The officer sneered again, clearly enjoying the power he thought he had over the situation. "No, I think we need to make sure you're not causing trouble. You're not just getting away with this." He glanced over at his partner, who was still standing by the security desk, watching but not intervening. The officer's confidence grew as he prepared to escalate the situation, assuming that his position gave him all the power. The teen stood still, his expression unchanged. He knew that engaging with the officer any further would only escalate things, and he wasn't interested in getting into a shouting match or a confrontation. But the officer was pressing him further, clearly enjoying the moment of control. "You think you can just come in here, looking the way you do, and I'm supposed to just accept it? People like you don't belong in places like this," the officer said, his tone mocking. The teen held his ground, not showing any signs of fear or aggression. He had been here before, judged by the way he looked, treated as though he were out of place. But there was a calm determination in him that refused to be shaken. "I am here because I have every right to be," he said, his voice firm, "and I'm asking you to respect that." Just as the officer prepared to press further, a sleek black car pulled into the parking lot, the engine humming as it came to a stop nearby. The sound of it quickly cut through the tension in the air, and the teen's expression softened slightly. He knew this was the turning point. He had been calm long enough, and now it was time to shift the power back where it belonged. The officer's mocking attitude didn't fade entirely, but as the car door opened and a tall figure emerged, the scene changed instantly. The woman who stepped out of the car had an aura of authority about her. She walked toward the teen with purpose, her steps confident. The officer, who had been so certain of his assumptions, paused for a moment. This wasn't just any random person. The woman approached with an air of familiarity. She had an undeniable presence. The officer, suddenly realizing who she was, stiffened. The confidence he had displayed moments earlier faltered as recognition set in. He realized that the teen wasn't just some random teenager. Before the officer could speak, the woman, with a calm yet commanding voice, turned to him. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the officer. The officer, who had been so confident just moments ago, now hesitated. He stammered, realizing the full weight of his mistake. The power dynamic in the situation had shifted dramatically. He wasn't dealing with an ordinary teen anymore. The teen's demeanor remained unchanged, but his lips twitched into a faint, knowing smile. "Everything's fine now," the teen said, looking at the officer, who now appeared flustered. "But next time, don't judge someone based on assumptions." The officer, clearly embarrassed, looked at the woman and then back at the teen, realizing the situation was slipping out of his control. The woman, now standing beside the teen, turned her full attention to the security guard. Her authoritative presence was undeniable, and the officer, who had been so dismissive moments ago, now found himself uncertain. The shift in the dynamic was instant, and the room seemed to pause as everyone realized the seriousness of the situation. The previously casual bystanders, now aware of what had just unfolded, waited for the next move. "Is there a problem, officer?" the woman asked again, her voice calm but commanding. She didn't need to raise her voice to assert authority. It was inherent in the way she carried herself. The officer's face flushed with embarrassment, and he fumbled for words. No, ma'am. Just a misunderstanding. We had some questions about his identification." The woman's eyes flicked to the teen who stood stoically beside her, his calm demeanor never faltering. He hadn't been intimidated by the officer's bullying, nor did he need to defend himself further. The woman's gaze returned to the officer, and the weight of her presence seemed to make him shrink. "You're questioning his ID?" she asked, the incredulity in her voice now hard to mask. "You've been harassing him, accusing him of being a problem without reason, all because of how he looks. Is that it?" The officer hesitated, suddenly unsure how to proceed. His previously arrogant stance crumbled in the face of the woman's unwavering authority. "I didn't mean... I just..." He couldn't finish his sentence, stumbling over his words, the realization of his mistake starting to set in. The teen, who had been observing the entire exchange with a quiet resolve, finally spoke. "It's all right, ma'am. No need for him to keep apologizing. I'm sure he didn't mean to offend me. He was just doing his job, right?" The last words were laced with subtle sarcasm, a reminder of how he had been treated unfairly. The woman glanced at him briefly, a slight nod in acknowledgement of his maturity in handling the situation. Then she turned back to the officer, her voice now more direct. "It's not about apologies. It's about accountability. Do you think it's appropriate to treat someone like that? Assume they're up to no good based on their race? Because that's what you did here. And it's unacceptable." The officer's discomfort deepened as the truth of his actions sank in. There was no denying it. He had made assumptions, acted out of prejudice, and treated the teen unfairly, all without knowing who he was or why he was there. The embarrassment was evident now, not only for the officer, but also for those who had witnessed it. The woman didn't let the officer off the hook. "I'm going to make sure your superiors hear about this," she said. "This behavior doesn't belong here, or anywhere. You've just insulted someone who had every right to be here, and you've made yourself look foolish in front of everyone. You should be ashamed." The security guard, now fully aware of the gravity of his mistake, nodded slowly, his face burning with humiliation. His arrogance had backfired. He had underestimated not only the teen but also the powerful woman standing beside him. "And," she added, her voice steady but firm, "if this is how you treat every person who doesn't meet your narrow view of who belongs, I suggest you reconsider your position here. Maybe it's time for some better training." The teen glanced up at the woman and gave her a small, appreciative smile. It was clear that the officer had learned nothing in this moment, beyond the fact that his assumptions had been wrong. But at least the woman had used her power to make him reconsider his actions, and the lesson would likely stick for him in a way that simple apologies never could. The officer, now standing in stunned silence, didn't argue. The shift in power was obvious to everyone watching. The teen had gone from being the victim of prejudice to standing confidently, with his family's legacy behind him, while the officer's authority had completely unraveled. As the crowd in the mall began to dissipate, returning to their shopping or meals, the scene was far from over. The story of how the young black teen had been mistreated by a security officer, and how his identity had completely changed the course of the situation, would soon spread. Word would get out. and people would be talking about the way the teen had been treated, how easily assumptions had been made about him, and how quickly the power dynamics had shifted when the officer realized his mistake. The woman, now standing tall with her son by her side, turned to the teen. "Let's not waste any more time here," she said with a soft smile. "You've handled yourself with more grace than anyone I know." The teen nodded, feeling a sense of quiet pride. Despite being wrongly accused and harassed, he hadn't let the situation overwhelm him. He had remained calm, composed, and dignified, showing not just the security guard but everyone around him that strength didn't come from intimidation. It came from within. As they walked away, the officer stood there, still visibly shaken by the encounter, a lesson learned too late. The story, now beginning to spread through the mall, would serve as a constant reminder of how easily biases can shape perceptions, and how crucial it is to challenge those biases when they rear their ugly heads. The following days, after the incident saw the video of the altercation between the black teen and the mall security officer going viral. Someone had recorded the entire encounter, capturing the moment when the officer refused to accept the teen's ID, mocked him, and escalated the situation unnecessarily. Within hours, the video spread across social media, and what had been a seemingly trivial misunderstanding became a focal point for wider discussions about racial profiling and systemic bias in everyday situations. As the video gained traction, so did the story behind it. News outlets picked it up, with many focusing on the twist. The young man that the officer had belittled was not just another teenager. He was the heir to a wealthy and influential family that owned the mall. The more people learned about the teen's identity, the more the public outrage grew. How could a person who had so much power and influence be treated this way simply because of the way he looked? Public reaction was swift. Some hailed the teen for his calm demeanor in the face of obvious racial bias, while others were furious at the treatment he had received from the officer. Activists, civil rights groups, and community leaders took to social media, using the video to highlight how common such incidents were and how dangerous the biases within law enforcement could be. The mall, faced with growing scrutiny, released an official statement expressing regret over the incident and pledging to review its security policies. They promised that they would conduct mandatory sensitivity training for all security staff to ensure that such an event would never happen again. While some people saw this as a positive step, others were skeptical, knowing that the real issue was not just about one officer, but about a systemic problem that ran much deeper than a few bad actors. Meanwhile, the officer involved in the confrontation faced immediate disciplinary action. The mall's management, under intense public pressure, initiated an internal investigation. The security guard, once confident in his position, found himself not just in trouble with his superiors, but in the midst of a public relations nightmare. The video had exposed not only his poor judgment, but also the underlying prejudices that many people, especially those in positions of power, held. The officer, whose earlier smugness had been evident in his treatment of the teen, was now forced to reckon with the consequences of his actions. He issued a public apology, but by then, the damage had already been done. His actions had gone viral, and he was now the subject of widespread criticism. People mocked him online for his inability to recognize the privilege that the young man had, all while dismissing him based solely on his appearance. But the officer's regret wasn't the only twist in this story. The teen, who had remained composed and calm throughout the ordeal, became a local hero in the wake of the incident. His family's business and their connection to the mall only added to the irony of the situation, making it clear just how misguided the officer's assumptions had been. While many focused on the drama of the confrontation, the teen and his family chose to use this moment for something bigger. They didn't just want an apology or to see the officer punished. They wanted to make sure that no one else would face the same kind of unfair treatment. The teen began speaking out about racial profiling, using his newfound platform to advocate for equality and fairness. He wanted to make sure that this incident wouldn't be just another viral video, but a turning point in how people viewed bias and privilege in everyday interactions. "We can't let this be swept under the rug," the teen said in one of his first interviews. "This is about more than just me or that officer. This is about how people who look like me are treated every day. It's about people being judged based on assumptions. This needs to change." In the following weeks, the teen and his family took action. They partnered with local civil rights organizations, using their voice and platform to push for more comprehensive training on racial bias for public institutions and businesses. They also called for greater accountability for those in positions of power, whether in law enforcement or retail. For the teen, this incident became less about his personal experience and more about the larger issue. His story was now a rallying cry for those who had faced similar bias, for those who had been treated unfairly because of how they looked. It wasn't about seeking revenge on one officer. It was about addressing a broader issue that affected people everywhere. As the days turned into weeks, the consequences of that single moment of racial profiling reverberated far beyond the walls of the mall. It sparked difficult but necessary conversations about racism in public spaces, about how people from marginalized communities are often treated with suspicion, and about the need for greater understanding and empathy across the board. In the wake of the viral video and the public outcry, change began to take root. The mall's management, under intense pressure from the community and activists, took significant steps to address the situation. They held a town hall meeting to discuss the incident, inviting local leaders and citizens to share their thoughts on the matter. It became clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger issue of racial profiling that needed to be addressed not just by the mall, but by businesses and institutions everywhere. As part of their response, the mall announced the implementation of new policies aimed at combating bias in their security operations. They made it clear that all security staff would undergo mandatory diversity and sensitivity training, with an emphasis on how racial bias can influence decision-making, even in seemingly small interactions. Additionally, the mall committed to regularly reviewing these practices to ensure that the behavior displayed by the officer would never be repeated. The officer who had initially mocked the teen faced disciplinary actions, including suspension, pending further investigation. His public apology did little to restore the damage done, but the fallout was swift, and he was forced to acknowledge his mistake publicly. The momentary embarrassment he experienced was only a small fraction of the larger consequences of his actions. His career was now uncertain, his actions having shattered the trust people once placed in him as an authority figure. For the teen and his family, the journey wasn't about seeking revenge. It was about using their platform to advocate for real change. They used their newfound visibility to speak out about racial profiling, about how people from marginalized communities were often unfairly targeted based on assumptions. They called on other institutions to adopt similar training, to challenge their own biases, and to create policies that ensured fairness for all. Through interviews, public speaking engagements, and online campaigns, The teen became a powerful voice for equality. His message was clear. No one should ever be judged based on their appearance, especially in public spaces. What had started as a personal injustice had evolved into a larger conversation about fairness, respect, and the need for systemic change. His family's legacy, which had once been a quiet part of the community's fabric, was now more visible than ever. The business they had built was respected, but now it was also a symbol of standing up against prejudice. The teen's experience was no longer just his own. It had become a beacon for others who had been mistreated or marginalized in similar ways. His ability to handle the situation with dignity and grace became a model for how to respond to injustice without resorting to anger or hostility. The officer's regret was evident, but the damage done by his assumptions couldn't be undone by a simple apology. He had failed to see the teen for who he truly was, and his behavior had now cost him far more than just the confrontation. It had cost him his credibility. His actions had been rooted in racial bias, and the public had seen it. The fallout from the incident would follow him for years to come, reminding him and everyone else of the dangers of unchecked assumptions. Meanwhile, the teen's family became actively involved in pushing for broader reform within law enforcement and retail spaces. They worked closely with civil rights groups to raise awareness about systemic racism and to advocate for policies that would prevent others from experiencing the same kind of mistreatment. The family's efforts didn't stop at local change. They sought to influence national conversations about racial equality and justice. The teen's calm, composed reaction to the officer's unjust behavior had set the tone for the entire situation. Instead of responding with anger or resentment, he had chosen to stand firm, using his voice to educate and inspire others. His actions reminded everyone that strength doesn't come from conflict. It comes from standing up for what is right, even when it's difficult. As the mall made its changes, the teen's message spread across communities. Businesses began to examine their own policies, and more people were willing to call out discrimination when they saw it. The ripple effect of this single incident sparked conversations and actions that led to real, tangible progress. People of all backgrounds were coming together to challenge prejudice and fight for fairness in ways they hadn't before. But the couple knew that real change would take time. They weren't expecting overnight miracles, but they were committed to continuing the work of breaking down the biases that fueled incidents, like the one in the mall. They understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger movement, one that would take sustained effort, not just from them, but from everyone willing to stand up against injustice. And as for the security guard, the experience left him with a bitter but valuable lesson. While his public apology had been an attempt to save face, it was his personal reflection that had the most lasting impact. The situation had forced him to confront the consequences of his actions and the way he had judged someone based on their appearance. His career was forever marked by that mistake. But perhaps in time, it could serve as a reminder to others in similar positions to check their own biases before making assumptions. The story of the black teen and his encounter with mall security isn't just a tale about a personal confrontation. It's a reflection of the deeper issues of racial bias and the unfair assumptions people make every day. This incident has left a lasting impact, not only on the individuals involved, but on the community at large. What started as a simple misunderstanding quickly became a pivotal moment for change, reminding us all of the power of standing up for fairness and equality, no matter the circumstances. The teen's calm, dignified response in the face of prejudice showed us that true strength doesn't come from anger, but from confronting injustice with grace and conviction. It also showed the power of accountability, not just for the officer who made assumptions, but for the entire system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Change happens when we stand together and demand respect for all, no matter their race or background. The mall's response and the public fallout demonstrated that real change is possible when we speak out and hold people accountable. The teen and his family used their platform to advocate for broader systemic reform, making sure that the lesson learned from this moment wasn't forgotten. Now, it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. The more we talk, the more we can learn and grow together. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. For more powerful stories about justice, equality, and standing up against bias. Together, we can create a world where respect and fairness are the norm for everyone. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that empower and inspire.